This Oral Rehab Lecture 6, Part 2. In Part 2, we're picking up at slide 8 in your slide set. So let's go to that. In slide 8, I'm beginning to kind of show you from slide 8, the next 6 or so slides are basically screenshots from the ICF checklist that's available to you either by link or by the PDF that I attached. But you can go to the link and get it yourself. It's the same one. My intent here in just kind of showing you the ICF checklist is just really more just to kind of give you a sense of some of the things that are contained in it. So where we left off here was the notion of activities and participation, and you can see that within this one table from the ICF, they kind of mix all of these up together. As we look through the next couple of ones, the next 6 or so, maybe it'll become a little bit clearer, maybe not. So, and you can find these in your ICF checklists specifically. But if you do, what you're going to find are these as topics within basically activities. So you can see that is all broken down, and I just selected the ones that I thought were sort of most relevant to our discussion here of rehabilitative audiology. So learning and applying knowledge. And so for us, really what we're considering as sort of a major activity would be listening. I've said to you maybe once or twice already in the course. If not, I'll say it here again, that learning to read is based on your ability to hear, and that may seem kind of odd, but yet, reading is simply a visual graphic code for sounds that you hear. And so those are two major activities that would be affected by hearing loss. As we kind of move along, again, the notion of your ability, an individual's ability to complete general tasks. Again, we'd be thinking that these might be influenced by a person's ability to understand commands and communication, that kind of stuff. At D3 in the slide set, not D3 in the slide set, but D3 in the ICF, is specifically communication. And under communication, obviously the ones that are most relevant that have been sort of broken out here for us on the oral rehab side anyway is receiving spoken messages. Clearly it would be an activity that would be compromised with hearing loss, with hearing impairment. Communicating with receiving nonverbal message, less so. And again, persons who have limited residual hearing, one would argue, would have probably excellent capacity to receive nonverbal messages, presumptively that those would be mostly visual in nature. So these are sort of vulnerable activities. So in the presence of hearing impairment. So clearly communicating with and receiving specifically spoken messages. Speaking also is considered to be an activity, as would be producing nonverbal messages. Conversation essentially would be the interplay of these two would be then sort of would then equal conversation, I guess. So the basic idea of speaking as an activity that would be vulnerable with hearing impairment is also something to consider. Speaking again is and the capacity to speak is going to be less of an issue for the majority of people who have hearing impairment, but certainly would be a key issue for some within that population. Now when we get to this D7 section of the checklist, now we're talking about interpersonal interactions and relationships. So within these now it's somewhere in between activities and participations. I've looked at these lists and this structure for a little while now, and it's sort of tricky to kind of sort of formally align one or more with the other. So that's not a question I would ask anybody. But I just wanted you to think about these general topics of activities versus participation. So I would see that the capacity to participate in basic interpersonal interactions or complex, to relate to strangers, etc., and all these other family relationships, all these kinds of things, really to me this is all participation stuff. This is all things that are areas of participation for a person in their life. And so in that sense, then, hearing impairment would cause a vulnerability, therefore a restriction, a participation restriction in these activities. And I think they're all, again, because most of these are going to be affected by an activity limitation when the activity limitation is communication, as it was in the previous slide. It's nothing earth-shaking here, honestly, but again, this is the modern organization, so to speak, the contemporary organization. Other major life areas listed here in this portion of the checklist includes education. So, I had said to you long ago in an earlier slide set that hearing loss, hearing impairment causes a progressive, progressive is the wrong word, but causes a sequential problem in education and then employment, so again, you can kind of see that kind of cascade here, which is basically what I had said to you earlier, that if you have hearing impairment that causes activity limitations relative to communication, that's going to have an effect on informal education, as might be at home, plus school, plus higher education. That leads to reduced chances of having remunerative, meaning employment that produces significant earnings, which then affects your ability to sort of have an economic life and to have economic self-sufficiency. So if we think about what sort of a goal of an independent adult in the United States, we would want to think that would be to be economically self-sufficient. And to the extent that someone is not, then that's where sort of government assistance and disability programs kind of step into the breach to try to provide some alternative wages and to offset the gainful employment. Continuing on again with major life activities, we have the idea now again of what would clearly be participation restrictions. That is to say, the individual's inability or lack of capacity to participate in community, social, and civic life. And so that would include any activities in the community, recreation, leisure activities, whatever sort of religious or spirituality, and so on, political life, citizenship, human rights. So participation in social and civic lives would be additionally, these kinds of participations would be restricted with hearing impairment. That's the basic sort of idea. So if we go back to the World Health Organization, to WHO, and we kind of look at this notion of what's disability, and you kind of look through it in some of the WHO materials, we see that as the World Health Organization and in the ICF, as disability is sort of described, we're not going to really see a specific exact definition as I would like to see a definition, but they sort of more or less describe it and describe it in terms of its contexts. So let's kind of see if we can peel it back a little bit. So disability is sort of an umbrella term, meaning it encompasses a lot of things, which includes impairments, activity limitations, as we described earlier in this slide set, and participation restrictions. So in a way then, according to World Health Organization, disability is really the kind of the complex sort of addition, if you will, of impairment, participation restriction, and activity limitations. Beyond that, though, and I don't have a slide in the slide set on this point, but beyond that, the notion of disability is also dependent on the interaction between the person, their body, which would to say their impairment, and features of the society in which the person lives, meaning the environment. So, lack of a better word, we can just talk about that as sort of the environmental features, and is to say the demands of the community. So, communicative demands and the features of the environment are going to affect the person's ultimate disability. So again, that's sort of what what this is all saying, and again, here are some definitions, as you saw on earlier slides, about what's an impairment, what's an activity limitation, what's a participation restriction. So again, activity limitations refer to the inability to complete a task or action. Participation restriction says, well, what kind of trouble does or difficulties does a person have in life situations? So this brings us to now sort of a critical point in the consideration here, and kind of brings us back to really what is a primary consideration in oral rehab, which is to say, what's a hearing problem, and how do we deal with hearing problems? So in the context of the ICF, so in the contemporary language of disability, what we have to consider is that hearing problems, whatever we can operationally define as hearing problems, will likely be activity limitations and restrictions in participation. In your text, somewhere around page 404, somewhere in there, and I have the older version down in this slide set, somewhere around slide 27, we've got something called the self-assessment of communication. This was something that this was done by the authors of your text, by Scow and Nurbin. And the original one was done in 1982, and I have a copy of that in the text in the slide that you have here. The text has a version that was done, a revision of it somewhere around 2003 is the one, and there's significant differences between these two. The basic idea, though, with hearing problems is to try to look at what are the areas of difficulty that an individual might have. The point being, getting back to our concept of heterogeneity in this population, is that even persons with the same impairments are going to have different problems. A person with an impairment might have no problems, and a person with the same impairment might have a lot of problems. And again, that might get back to sort of the environmental context and the demands that are on them, and those sorts of things. Self-assessment measurements, such as this one that your authors did, which is just abbreviated as the SAC, Self-Assessment of Communication, is an inventory, basically a laundry list of different problems, mainly activity limitations, but also restrictions in participation. And again, we'll talk about that really a little bit more in part 3 of this, to a little bit of some extent. But I've got a slide set coming up toward the middle to the end of the course where we're going to deal more specifically in just these kinds of self-assessment inventories. But it's just important to know at the moment that we have them, that we know about them. Again, just to summarize here and then to jump out of this slide set, in oral rehab, our job is to really minimize the effects and consequences of the impairment and reduce the number and severity of the problems that it imposes on the individual, whether that's activity limitations or participation restrictions. That much of it doesn't so much matter in terms of what we're going to call it. The net effect is really what we want to try to do is to minimize the effects of the impairment, the consequences of the impairment, so as to reduce the problems that a person might have. And so now we'll talk a little bit more in slide set 3 of this lecture 6, and kind of focus a little bit more on the nature of hearing problems and their measurement.